Hello, and a very warm welcome to my YouTube. My name's Chris, and this evening we're taking a look at a memory from back in 2009 when myself and John Kempton came up with the crazy idea of organising a fly-in of, well, extraordinary size and also complexity, because we were going to organise for two World War II aircraft to fly into the former RAF Bolt Head. Now bear in mind, nothing had flown in of this kind since 1945, so it's now 2009, and we were planning to bring in a Hawker Hurricane and a Supermarine Spitfire to an airstrip that was essentially 600 metres long and not that wide really for the size of aircraft. So the first part of the plan was to embark on extending the runway, which we were able to do by the very kindness of the National Trust. They allowed us to take another 400 metres of their land eastward, to a complete length of 1,000 metres, so we could safely bring in a Spitfire and a Hurricane without too much, without giving them too many of the jitters. It was still quite a challenge, because to extend the runway by another 400 metres required quite a considerable amount of work. But we had lots of help, we were full of enthusiasm, and I have to say the one thing that we were full of was naivety. We were completely naive about the whole thing, because our idea was not to charge an entrance fee on the gate. We were going to raise the money by donations only. Quite an undertaking. The Spitfire alone was £4,500, which had to be paid before Anthony would bring it out of the hangar in Wales. Peter Vasher was slightly more kind, and his Hurricane was £2,500, I think, and he very kindly arranged for that aircraft to fly down. It was just a monumentous task we had in front of us, but we gaily carried on and tried to and attempted to put it together. If I could just explain, we're making an approach to the former RAF Bolt Head, and we're attempting to land on the westerly runway. And when you approach in this direction, you've got these cliffs in front of you, 450 feet of height, and the landing ground starts, as you can see, just beyond the line of trees. And from there, during the war, you had about 1,500 metres. On this occasion, we were going to only have around about 1,000 metres. And as you see, you come over the cliffs here, and then the runway starts would have started almost immediately after the end of the line of the trees. And this is the kind of matting that was used to form the runway. And as you can see, we're now approaching, and this is where the runway would have started, and then it extended right down to the intersection, which was tarmac. So you had essentially two grass runways on coconut matting and a track and bar situation called Summerfield tracking, and the only hard section of the runways was the tarmac at the intersection. And this is a couple of photographs from 1945, and you can see the extent of the runway going out to the right hand side almost to the cliff edge. These really are quite rare photographs. And as we approach where we're going to set down and land, just to the right here, you can now see that the runway is what we have today. This is the runway. This is the layout of the airfield during wartime, and this is the Hurricane, who's making an approach now, coming back into land after giving his display. So he's making an approach to these runways. This is the runway layout as it was during the Second World War, and the lines denote where the wartime runways ran, and then just to one side is the grass landing ground that we use to this day. You can just see now the strip that's used just in the distance there. And this Hurricane is now making its approach onto that landing ground, which is effectively bare ground with mat and tracking laid on the top. very, very effective. And the Hurricane touches down, and it's a very, very capable aircraft. It performs very well on shorter grass strips. And this was effectively an advanced landing ground. It was established in 1941, and it was fully operational right through to 1945. The last sort of wartime aircraft to land was the Wellington bomber, which crash landed here in 1946. So to bring back two mighty aircraft from the World War II era was quite an exciting project. The first was Peter Vascher's Hurricane. It's a Hawker Hurricane R4118, and it's the only airworthy Hurricane to have taken part in the Battle of Britain, and it is perhaps the most historic Second World War fighter to have survived the conflict. And the Hurricane originated from the drawing board, of course, of the legendary Sir Sidney Cam, who went on to design other iconic fighters like the Tempest, Hunter and Harrier. Now, Peter Vascher's Hurricane had moved to India, where it was going to be a training aircraft. It wasn't actually used, as it turned out, but it eventually ended up at an Indian university, and there it was found in a very derelict condition by Peter Vascher. Peter organised for it to be brought back to the UK and restored, and you'll see it flying at Bolthead in this film. The Supermarine Spitfire flying at Bolthead back in 2009 was owned and flown by Anthony Hodgson, and the aircraft was based in North Wales. This particular Spitfire originated at the Castle Bromwich factory in 1944 as a single-seat Mark 9. It was subsequently converted to a two-seat aircraft under the design of Nick Grace and Dick Melton. It now Duxford now been aerodrome sold and lives at with the aircraft Duxford Restoration aerodrome. Company. With the aircraft Restoration Company. The Hawker Hurricane was constructed at the Gloucester factory in 1940, and that August it was delivered to 605 Squadron, and this was halfway through the Battle of Britain. And for the remainder of the conflict, this airframe flew 49 sorties from RAF Croydon, and during that time R4118 destroyed or damaged 5 enemy aircraft. On the 22nd of October 1940, this Hurricane was herself shot down. The damage was considered repairable, and the aircraft was back in service by January 1941. Honesty compels to mention, though, that during this battle the majority of the RAF squadrons hadn't been equipped with Spitfires yet, but with Hawker Hurricane. In the course of the battle, Hurricanes have downed more enemy aircraft than all other types combined. Whereas the Spitfire took on the German fighters, the Hurricanes often created carnage amongst the German bombers. This successful airplane, of which over 15,000 have been delivered between 1937 and 1944.
The Hurricane, of course, was a mixture of ancient and modern almost. We had the steel tubular construction, and then on top of that was placed the wooden framework, which is fairly lightweight. And then the fabric people would come with their great lengths of stuff and simply chuck it over the top. And they're dressmakers, really. It would all be done by hand. The fabric would be pulled down into place, and it was all stitched together. The big innovation was the blind flying panel. In the old biplanes, you would have an altimeter and an airspeed indicator and a rev counter. They'd just be randomly dotted around the cockpit. With the Hurricane and everything else that followed, including most of the bombers, I think we all had much the same blind flying panel, which was 6 instruments, 6 of them. And that was standard for all aircraft from that point onwards, which is a jolly good thing, because at least one could hop from one type to another without too much difficulty.
The purpose of the 2009 Bolthead Classic was to raise funds for the Redfern Health Centre and the Macmillan Cancer Trust. We were very fortunate and had great support from the Squire family, who owned RAF Bolt Head, and also we were able to open the Cold War bunker, which at the time was owned by Trevor Lethbridge and Derek Brooking. We were also very, very fortunate to be able to have Colin Billington and a whole collection of vintage buses, which on the day and on the weekend they did a park and ride, and people were able to come to the show on a vintage bus from all over the South Hams, and all these buses turned up. Plus we had probably several hundred vintage cars, ranging MG sports cars, Jaguars, Bentleys and many more, with also a collection of vintage motorcycles. We also were very fortunate to have a Merlin engine on display, which was actually running, and our guest of honour that weekend was Flight Lt Peter Graham. He was actually based at RAF Bolt Head back in 1944. He was flying with 41 Squadron, who were flying the very, very mighty engined Spitfire Mark 12. Peter sadly was then shot down in Northern Europe and spent some time as a POW. He was quite a tall character, over 6 foot, and when he was captured he was 14 stone, and his wife said when he came back from being a prisoner of war his body weight was down to 7 stone. But he turned up at the weekend. We booked him in at the Cottage Hotel down at Hope Cove, which was the officers' mess during the Second World War. So it was a very, very nostalgic return for Peter Graham, and he had a really, really enjoyable weekend, and he was great company and a great character. In the summer of 1939, Rolls-Royce produced a more powerful Merlin. This was of 1,185 horsepower. This became the standard engine for the next Hurricane version, the Mark II. Just like the Spitfire, at this moment various versions based on armament came into being. The usual version was armament of 8 7.7mm Browning machine guns. This version was designated from the moment on as a Hurricane Mark II-A. The B version, this aircraft was equipped with a formidable number of 12 machine guns and was designated the Mark II-B. The C version was the Mark II-C, was equipped with 4 20mm Hispano-Zuzi cannons, and the D version was the Hurricane Mark II-D, was armed with 2 machine guns and 2 40mm cannon. Later in the war, the possibility was created of the Mark II-B and C to carry 8 3-inch rockets. These were designed or designated as Mark II-E. In order to compensate for the shortage of British naval fighter aircraft, various Hurricanes were built as naval versions. It was a stopgap measure, though due to the carnage in the Atlantic inflicted by the German U-boats, the Fleet Air Arm badly needed good fighters, and the Hawker Hurricane was selected as a temporary solution. The first version was a direct descendant of the Mark I. From 1941 onwards, 3 different versions were produced. The Sea Hurricane Mark I was the first. It was a standard Mark I adapted to be launched by catapult from the so-called cam ship freighters equipped with a catapult. This was the first attempt to provide some protection to the Atlantic convoys. The disadvantage was that the pilot had to ditch in the ocean after his mission, and hence the aircraft was lost. The Mark I-B was the first Sea Hurricane entirely suitable for operations from carriers, and also entered service in the course of 1941. I really hope you found this short film and a look back at the Hawker Hurricane of some interest. It was particularly interesting for me because we invited Peter Vasher's Hawker Hurricane Mark I to our event at Bolt Head in 2009, and it gave and gives many memories to many people, and people often ask, when are you going to organise another air show like 2009? Sadly, I think it is beyond us at the moment. The logistics are incredibly difficult, and I think really it was a one-off event back then. Anyway, take the greatest of care, and I really, really look forward to seeing you on the next one. Have a subscribe. All the very best. Cheers for now.